Check if my mic is working. There we are. Now I can hear it. Hi there. So we had this lovely presentation about stress reduction and feeling good, and I'm here to talk about evaluation. So a little bit of a contradiction, I recognized, but maybe you'll feel a little bit differently about evaluation after I've finished the next hour or so. And I wanted to thank you for being invited to this. I'm really thrilled to be here. I actually come out of the settlement sector. I started out my career teaching English in the workplace, in the garment factory, more explicitly. And gradually I was doing curriculum development and program development and was working at a college when iCare was introduced. So I have worked with iCare and I have written proposals and reports and all those kinds of things. So, and a number of years ago I started working more with evaluation. And I know how much stress there is on the sector around evaluation. And I had done some learning and some reading around different ways of looking at evaluation that I think might help you think about evaluation in some other ways. So what we're going to do today, we're going to focus on sort of what are some low intensity things that staff within SWIS and SWIS-TÉÉ can do to maybe track and monitor their impact a little bit more. And we're going to start with a warm-up activity in just a second. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the concept of impact and impact evaluation. And just really briefly, is there anybody in the room that has taken or is taking the Looking for the Ripple Effect training? Okay, a couple. So some of you may recognize some of the slides. And then we're going to get really practical and think about some ways, like what can actually be done in a low intensity way to keep an eye out for impact, the impact that you're having. So we're going to start with the handout. On the handout, there's one side that starts, it sort of has clouds on it. And I want you to take a look there because there's, of course, a lot of different entities that you have an impact on, right? Students, of course, whether they're younger children or whether they're teenagers, the parents, the extended family, the extended community. Here, I'll show you what it looks like. I think it was at the back, not the logic model, but it looks like this. This one, so we'll just use this page now and then we'll use the other page later. And what I've done is I've put a couple of the entities that you work with on this page. And there's far, far more, of course. You can think about volunteers, textbook writers. You know, there's a big ecosystem around the work that you do. And I want you to take a couple of minutes and to think about that question, what changes because of the work that you do? And what it's going to end up being, you're going to end up using words like increases or expands or strengthens or makes more of or new, right? The kinds of good things that happen because of your work. Or it may also be things like reduces for the bad things. Right? So it can be positive things that are gained or negative things that are prevented. Just see if you can come up with like 20 things on your page. 15 is fine too. But try and push it past 5. Right? The idea is to really think about the people that you work with and to think about what changes for the people that you're thinking about because of the work that you do. Okay? So what's changing for students? When you think of teachers that you've worked with, what have you helped them with? What have they gained? And you can just draw spokes out of the cloud. Just come up with all sorts of ideas. Think about the school structure, the school leadership, maybe even school boards. Maybe there's something that's changed for the school boards over time because of the SWIS and the TÉÉ program. And if you start to run out of ideas a little bit, you can think about a second question. Why does the change matter? Because in effect, there's a thing that follows because of the thing that you do. So those are also changes that are happening because of your work. So there might be direct changes, there might be indirect changes. How many people have 5 things on their page already? Yeah. 10 things? Huh? More? 50? Okay, there's more. Thumbs up over there. Awesome. I'm not going to send a microphone around right now, but as we proceed for this next hour, feel free to keep adding to that as you get other ideas, right? But my hunch is, like we heard the panel of the students yesterday, right? If you think about what they were saying, there was an academic impact. You could feel their attachment to their SWIS worker. So you knew that they had a trusted bond now with somebody within the system that they could go to, right? Sense of belonging. The one young woman talked about having a different idea for her career than she might have had before, right? These are all impacts that are happening because of the interaction with the SWIS or the TÉÉ worker. One of the other women was talking about some of the pressure coming off her family because there was another way to get interpretation that she talked about not having to do that. Getting connected to resources, IRCC mentioned that. Parents are getting connected to resources. One of the stories, actually it came up at the table today, but one of the stories that I heard a number of years ago when I was doing an evaluation was that there was a refugee family that had come over and only some of the kids had their paperwork, and so only some of the kids were able to get registered for school. And so the SWIS worker was working with trying to get the paperwork taken care of. Some school divisions were open, some school divisions weren't. So they were trying to navigate schools of choice. With staff, whether it's librarians or teachers or guidance counselors, they're learning a lot because of the work that you're doing. Things like, I've heard stories of like handling cultural and intergenerational tensions, right, that staff need to, or another one that I heard a lot of with teenagers was around dating, healthy sexuality, sensitive topics, what do you talk about, what do you not talk about. One girl said she really wanted to go to a sleepover and her parents didn't understand. So the SWIS was trying to give a little bit more information about that, right? I also had one, this is a bit more unusual maybe, but I was talking to a mum and she had a large family and her youngest child had been born with Down syndrome and in her culture it was considered a curse. So the school was working with her to navigate the resources, and the little guy's doing great. He's in childcare, he's learning to ride a bike and all that. But so there was a lot of extra support that was being provided there, right? So this room, if you can imagine, is filled with those kinds of impacts, right? And if you think about, if we could, I was trying to think of a way that we could do this, and we can't because there's too many people. And I know we also have a number of people online that are maybe doing this as well. This is the impact inventory of the SWIS and the TÉÉ program. These are your outcomes. This is your collective impact in what you're doing out there. And what I sometimes say is, if you imagine if this work disappeared overnight, the problems that would surface, that's your positive impact, is that you are taking care of some of those issues before they even start. So these are things that you can report on, right? That's the bottom line on it. And I want to make a point here, a distinction between the difference of program quality, which means it's good, and program impact, which means it's making a difference. I didn't ask you in the beginning to write down things that you're good at. I asked you what changes because of your work and why that change matters, because something else follows from that. And those are the two questions that when you want to think about tracking and monitoring your impact, you can think about what changes because of us. There's a direct link there. And why does that change matter? Because you don't want to spend evaluation time. Nobody has evaluation time, right? You don't want to spend time on evaluating things that don't matter. It's better to evaluate one or two things that really do matter, that really do show your impact, than to do a lot of evaluation and collect a lot of data that you can't actually use. I have seen filing cabinets full of surveys that nobody will ever look at again, right? So better to ask 3, 4 really good impact questions, right, than to ask a whole lot of questions. And so that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. This whole notion of impact evaluation and this idea of change is kind of captured in this diagram. I was trying to explain to somebody a number of years ago how it shifts our thinking about what we're evaluating if we think about impact. Because let's say there's a trajectory of change, right? There's a kind of maybe a moment, maybe it's a critical incident, maybe not, where a child or a youth or a family connects with you. And that's that intersection, that green circle at the intersection of that turquoise line. So there's a trajectory. And if, I'll be somewhat dramatic, if you weren't there at that moment, things might look quite different. They might look more like the dotted line. It doesn't mean that everything is awful forever, but it means that something better takes longer to happen. But because you are there, because you are connecting people to resources, because you are helping to build confidence, you are helping people navigate systems, individuals or families or communities can travel that solid turquoise line to something better. And you can see that really close to the green circle, it's more solid green, because that's your immediate impact. The immediate outcomes are far more likely to be because of you. And those changes can be attributed back to you. But over time, things shift, right? And as you're moving into more of an intermediate time zone, maybe after the kids have left school or after you're not working with them as much, now other influences are starting to come in as well. Or maybe the service providers that you connected them with, they're coming into that intermediate zone there. So maybe you're not responsible for all of those changes, but you made a contribution to those changes. So you made the first step, and because of that first step, the next step becomes more possible, and the step after that becomes more probable. And I was listening to a podcast. This is what I do for fun in my spare time. I was listening to an evaluation podcast, and it was somebody who was sort of a bit of a leader in the evaluation field. And he said, often when we're working with people, we're dealing in probabilities. And I was so grateful for him to say that, because when we're increasing probabilities, we're doing good. It doesn't all have to be that we are fixing every problem, right? Going back to what the presenter just before me was saying. We're not responsible for all of it all the time, but if we can put some good pieces in place in that immediate realm, then we move people into a better trajectory. And I'll have 3 slides now that are along those same ideas. It's this idea that as people, we're not isolated. We live in families, we live in communities. And so the work that you're doing when you are providing information to an individual, let's take an example of a teenager. You're providing information to a teenager, that information also goes out to that teenager's circle of friends, right? Or you're helping a family, parents deal with something, they're talking to their friends, and so it goes beyond that. Or if you're dealing on the indirect service side, maybe you're working with school boards, or you're working with policymakers within the Department of Education, or you're dealing with entrance requirements, kind of that systems level, right? There's also things that are changing there that could be because of you, and often they're happening outside your line of vision, but they are happening, and they ripple down in the other way. So really, and I was saying this in my training at one point, it occurred to me about a year ago that I don't know any other sector other than the settlement sector that is as transformational, because it touches so many aspects of people's lives. And so it really is, the changes and the impacts are happening throughout there. So when you're thinking about your evaluation strategies, it may be possible to notice either some things that are happening kind of on what we call the front lines, right, that are worth writing down, or maybe there are things happening in the systems that are worth writing down. And I'm thinking, for example, in terms of the success stories that go into our year-end reporting, right? It doesn't go into iCare, but there's other places where we can tell different kinds of success stories. I'm stuck. It's like Hotel California. We can't get out of the ripple effect. There we go. Is it coming? There it is. Another way of thinking about it, of this concept of direct and indirect, is thinking about the splash and the ripple. When you're working directly with people, whether it's teachers, guidance counselors, or principals, or students, you're making that immediate splash, but there's a ripple beyond that. So some of the things that you might see, if you're working with children, for example, children are better connected to schools. That might be an impact or an outcome. They're joining clubs, they're getting involved in more activities, they're accessing more resources, they're getting help when they need it, right? And all the other myriad of things that you would have written down. And because of that, maybe the parents are getting more involved in the school community, and they're attending more events, and maybe they're coming to parent-teacher conference meetings. Maybe they're beginning to volunteer in the school, right? Which is helping them think about ways of becoming more employable. And then over time, the education system actually becomes more supportive of newcomer families, because some of the kinks are getting worked out, some of the log jams are being removed because of the work that you're doing. So, for example, interpreters are more available now than they were certainly when I started teaching ESL. There's a lot of things in place now that were not in place at the time. And I won't spend too much time on this, but you know, it's sort of a list of there's direct, measurable effects of what you do, that you see, that you're seeing all the time, that people are telling you. But there's also these indirect other things that are happening that you might just occasionally hear about, but they are happening. And all of these things are, of course, you have the logic model in your package as well. Ultimately, these things are all leading towards the kinds of things that the IRC has identified in its logic model as outcomes that they're hoping the sector will achieve over time. And IRCC's immediate outcomes are our longer-term outcomes. It takes time to get to that point. But if we think about the kinds of things that they're asking for as well, the reasons that we're getting funding, it's about parents and guardians being more aware, getting more involved, right? Parents and guardians are getting help they need. Students are better connected to schools, the example I just used. These are the kinds of things that are coming up in your work and that you no doubt have written down across your tables. Now, just curious, like some of these kinds of outcomes that IRCC has in its logic model, are these the kinds of things that you wrote down on the cloud side? Yes? Just curious, were there any things that you wrote down that were outside the IRCC logic model? No? It's very possible that there's other aspects to that.
I'm not seeing like communication here. So communication, like parents are able to communicate with schools and schools being able to communicate with parents, especially in the
Okay, so that was about parents and teachers communicating together, that maybe isn't as well articulated in the IRCC logic model. Yeah. So there could very well be other things, yeah?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if maybe for the parents, would they have more feeling like safety and less stress about their kids' development in the future?
Oh, nice. So the comment was, do the parents have less stress? And there was another part of that about safety and less stress and more sense of safety around their children doing well in school. So that there's a social, emotional aspect to all the work that you're doing as well, right? And I know I hear sometimes, well, confidence, it's so hard to measure confidence, but we kind of know what the lack of confidence looks like. And we know what the lack of confidence leads to. So in a similar way, lack of stress, like there are things that, but when we remove the barriers, other things can happen in a better way or more quickly, right? That trajectory is better. So those are things that we can keep an eye open for when we're doing evaluation. I'll just take a couple more comments. Yeah?
Oh,
but I can, oh, there it is.
Yeah. Is it? Okay, so there's something that happened that opened my eyes actually to other perspectives, and it's not there, which is racism against newcomers' kids, and that's unfortunately happening in some of the schools. And we had to deal with it like in person, because even like the principals in the schools had no idea, and even the counselors in the school had no idea, and the kids unfortunately were afraid to speak about it.
Right.
So once that has been brought up, we had actually to think about doing some workshops to teachers to teach them about the difficulties that these kids have already gone through until they arrived to Canada and started fresh, so they don't need the more pressure. So that's one of the things also that's very important to note.
Absolutely. And that whole, I think there's something about school environment. I have maybe the third bullet from the bottom. Yeah, it's not quite the same. But you're right. And all of those kinds of things, what I'm going to tell you in the next couple of minutes is if those are the outcomes that you know you're achieving, that you're doing really well, where you are really making a difference in that area, you can think about ways that you might be able to track and monitor some of that. It's not going to go in iCare, and you may not be able to measure it all and count it all to the nth degree. We are not doing a PhD thesis. We are trying to describe our value, right? Which gives us a little bit of leeway. And I will say that there's very little baseline data for a lot of this, because measuring a lot of these impacts is still very new. So we don't have a lot of data out there to go back to. So we have to do some exploration, and we have to go at it with a little bit of curiosity to see what we're actually changing, and then to pursue some of the things that we're seeing to say, well, how would I measure this? How would I measure that racial incidents are going down in the school because of the work we're doing? And then to problem solve. And maybe that's one thing that you try to measure for a year, and that's it. Because that's big, right? And that one thing has a lot of implications. It has a lot of ripples. So maybe you just focus on that one thing and try to problem solve that to gather some data. So I can see some of your brains start to turn here. Evaluation, you know, I think we're so colonized in thinking about evaluation a certain way. And some of it is because databases track data in a certain way. But that isn't the only way that we can make an impact argument. It isn't just about quantity. Sometimes it's also about quality. We need both, right? But we need to see what's changing and why the change matters so that we can tell the impact argument of the work that we do. So I want you to take a look now. Before we can even gather data, we need to know what we're trying to gather data for, right? Or gather feedback. It doesn't even have to be formal data. So when you take a look at the different things that you wrote around your clouds there, take one or two of those. And in a moment, I'm just going to walk you through this. And then on the flip side of that page, there's a bit of like the top boxes. You're going to fill those out in just a moment, but I'll give you a bit more direction for that. So when we're writing outcomes, what I find useful, at least, in the work that I've done, is that I think about what is the outcome that I'm trying to prove. And I phrase that kind of in two chunks. I often think about it like Lego, where I think about I have to connect the Lego like a train. And who is the primary beneficiary? Who is kind of experiencing the change? Who is the benefiting from the work that we're doing? Ultimately, the newcomer, but directly. So in this case, you can see there it says teachers. That's one of the primary beneficiaries, or counselors, or maybe it's student leadership, or the school board, right? Whatever you decided there. And then the second part that goes with that as an outcome statement starts with an active verb. The teachers integrate diverse perspectives into daily classwork more often. You can see the language that's in italics there. That's the wording that shows a change. So more often, the counselors are handling it with greater cultural awareness, the student leadership, more school events, the school board, new policies. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at some of the things that you wrote on this side of your paper, and I want you to see whether you can create an outcome statement, and then what we're going to do is think about, well, how could we prove it? But start first by making, like, let's say the school community monitors incidents of racism more closely, or addresses them more quickly, or addresses them better, right? Like, you know the words that you would want to choose for whatever your context is. So identify kind of the beneficiary. It can be one of those, or it can be something different. And then see if you can write a sentence. And I'm going to say, I do this all the time. It takes a good amount of time. You can't just toss it off, because you have to think about what is it that's actually changing. What is there more of? What's getting better? What's increasing? What's expanding? What's getting stronger? Okay? So take a moment and see if you can write 2 outcome statements. Maybe choose some that you're really proud of, like some that are, worth maybe doing evaluation around. And if you're online, I'm hoping that you also have the handout that you can try it out. And I wrote in the logic model at the end there. You don't have to, but if you want, it can be kind of interesting to see, okay, this is what our program does really well. We really do well with the school administration, or we really do well with the school staff. And then see whether that's reflected in one of those logic model statements from IRCC. And actually, I'm just thinking, I'm seeing some of you take photos. You could do this with your colleagues. You could brainstorm. Like what I often do is I brainstorm it with stickies. Everybody gets a pad of stickies, and everybody gets 5 minutes on their own to write down the changes that they have witnessed in the last 6 months, let's say. And then they go up on the wall, and we cluster them. And then you start to see, oh my goodness, there's this big cluster of this kind of outcome that lots of people have seen. And that tells you it's probably worth spending a bit of time on that one. Yeah. And again, can you imagine if we could get everybody's statement out? We were going to put it on Slido, but we don't have time today. But there's a lot of different kinds of outcomes, right? And all the improvements that are captured in those verbs in that second part. And if you're thinking about reporting or you're thinking about proposal writing, these are the kinds of outcome statements that you can use in your proposals. You know, there's always that section where it says, how will you know? What's your evidence? It's these kinds of statements that you can then use. Okay, we're going to move beyond this because we don't have the time. So when you think about those two, actually, how many of you wrote a statement about students? Students, how many wrote statements about parents? Or teachers? Less about teachers, so mainly students and parents. Okay. So when you think now, like the way that evaluation, if you're thinking about impact, what changes, why does it matter? Part of it is trying to understand that idea of why does it matter to somebody. And we have to think about what methods can we use to collect evidence. And if I ask you, what methods do you use right now to collect feedback about the impact of your work? What would you say? Surveys. I think it's the number one, right? It's so much fun to do SurveyMonkey. And yet I will say that it is incredibly difficult and time-consuming to write a really good survey. And I personally, in the work that I've done, I do third-party evaluations in the settlement sector when I go out. I way prefer some other methods. So, but part of it is figuring out what's the level of rigor that we actually need, right? Because there's very formal methods that need to be designed really well in order to work well and in order to give you good data. The ones that are most common are surveys, absolutely. Whether it's, and the unfortunate thing is too, a lot of the survey platforms go into a spreadsheet, which means that they can't be analyzed easily. Like SurveyMonkey is called a relational database, so you can pull apart the parts, and you can apply things like GBA plus to it and get a different kind of perspective. But a lot of the more complex survey tools are too hard to design well. Focus groups are often used, also can be very intensive, right? It feels like you have to get people in a room, you have to have a note taker and flip charts and all kinds of things. Formal interviews. Who has time to get together for a formal interview, right? And on the other hand of the spectrum, we have a lot of ad hoc feedback gathering, which kind of happens off the side of our desk, which is a function of the workload that you were talking about yesterday and the busyness and the fact we don't tend to have people necessarily with evaluation expertise within the organizations. There's a lot of work. We don't have the tools, we don't have the platforms. So some of the ad hoc methods are unsolicited testimonials and comments that come our way, right? And especially the people that are doing the direct work, they're hearing evaluation gold all the time, and it doesn't necessarily go anywhere else. It just stays there. Conversations that happen, casual observations. So part of the challenge we have is to find that sweet spot. How do we figure out some semi-formal methods that we can use to do evaluation? And there's some examples here. I'll go into a little bit more detail as we go, that aren't as much work and rigor as the formal methods, but are more, like the words I used here, more planned, more thoughtful, more consistent, very lean. Just focus in on what you really need, the impact argument you're really trying to make. Do feedback gathering in that way. And it's about having a bit more of a curiosity mindset, an investigation or detective or sleuth mindset, as opposed to necessarily scientific method. We just don't have time often to apply a full scientific method to the evaluation that we're doing. And to try and think of evaluation activities that we can integrate into what we're already doing instead of adding things on. Or sometimes it's about just collecting better data and not necessarily collecting more data. There's a lot of satisfaction data that gets collected, and satisfaction isn't about impact, right? It's not about what changes. So you want to figure out, like, of all the different methods that you can use to collect feedback, how do you focus in on very tightly on, here's the outcome that we're trying to demonstrate, here's the data that we want to get, or the feedback we want to get to be able to make that impact argument with some evidence, as opposed to trying to prove everything all the time. And a couple of, so I'm starting to move a little bit more into kind of methods now, into the practical part of it, methods that I've used that I have found effective. I forget who it was yesterday. It may have been Amira, actually, who was talking about, like, one of the ways to reduce stress a little bit is to have a plan. And the plan can be low-key. It can be, in May, we're going to do a focus group, and in October, we're going to do a focus group, and the rest of the time, we're just not. We don't have time, right? So part of it is planning a strategy. Once that strategy is in place, and you can develop that with your colleagues, then it gives you something to lean on that you don't have to reinvent every time you offer a new workshop, every time you're doing something new. It doesn't catch you off guard. Oh my goodness, we have to report in a month. You know, where's our data? If it comes in little drips and drabs along the way, it takes some of the pressure off. And part of it is developing an impact mindset. And it goes back to that difference between program quality and program impact. Program quality, you probably know you have good programs, right? So asking if people like the program, it would be better to ask what's changing for them because of your program. You will get evaluation gold if you shift. And it can be, I just looked at one from a client that I worked with yesterday. She had very, very short questions that are all about impact, and she had a 4-point scale of, I think it was absolutely quite a lot, or absolutely yes, not very much, no, not at all, or something. 4 points, and I think she had 8 very simple sentences that kind of a benchmark 3, 4 could read. And they were all impact-based, and she's going to get great data. So it doesn't have to be complicated. So think about impact, think about what changes, don't describe the activities, describe what changes because of the activities. It can help to pick a theme, like you mentioned, racism. It can be increase in cultural awareness of the teachers. It can be student engagement. It can be academic success. You know what your program does really well. So if you pick a theme and stick with that for 6 months or a year, and then change, pick a new theme the next year, right? And then if you cycle through that for each 3-year funding agreement, by the end of 2 funding agreements, you will have a fair bit of data collected about 2 or 3 things that really make your impact argument well, that you can then build your success stories around. Teaching colleagues to be story catchers, because people on the front lines are hearing the stories all the time. What I've done is I've created a G Drive document that all the staff have access to, and we pick a theme, and that's the name of the theme, and then depending on how many columns you want to put into the table, and then anybody who hears a story that is connected to that theme goes in and puts it into that document. And at the end of 6 months, I maybe have 20 stories to take a look at, and I can go through with a highlighter and go, oh, look, pink is for this theme, this, and this happened. 8 out of the 20 said this. Now I'm starting to get quantitative data for the qualitative data that's come in around that theme without it being a ton of work, right? Because when you hear those stories, they feel good. You want to put them somewhere that others can see them. They can also become fodder for program improvement if you have a staff meeting about those stories every 6 months, right? Oh yeah, that was the next bullet there. So you can gather, you can take a look at it, you can analyze it. Is this the impact we expect it to be having? Is there something we can report on? Is there a need that's coming out for our program that we have to address in a different way? And then if you feel like you're not getting enough data yet or not enough feedback, or you need to understand something a little bit differently, you either go back in and collect more, or you say, we got it, we're good. We understand. We have 2 or 3 really good case studies that we can use to describe the impact of the work that we're doing. Let's move on to a new theme, right? And a lot of this is around asking better questions. Like I said, when you ask impact questions, and usually, like there's a sequence down here, those 4 bullets, those are interview techniques that I use, where I start them where they're at now, and then I take them back to when they connected to the service, and I walk them through and say, so what's changed for you between then and now? If they're kind of confused by what I'm asking them, I say, imagine if you took a selfie of yourself at that point, and you take a selfie of yourself now, and you put those 2 things side by side. What's changed for you because of this program or because of the help that you got? And then depending on how strong they are, I don't do this with vulnerable people, but I might say, what do you think would have happened if you hadn't gotten this help? And then they tell me the story of the dotted line. And then I also have a prevention argument. I can describe what didn't happen. And it doesn't mean that that would have happened, but they're telling me what they feared their experience might have been otherwise. So it's called latent trajectory modeling, where you have the model, you have what did happen, and you're comparing it to what might have happened. Not what would have, but what might have. And the main thing is, too, that you're trying to get beyond just the did they like it questions. And the did they learn it is really useful. Do they know something more? Do they understand something more? But even more powerful is, what did they do with that learning? How did the behavior change because they're more aware? What did the teachers change? What did the teachers do differently? Now they understand that dating, as an example, it came up in one of the conversations, that dating is not appropriate in some cultures. So how are they handling this topic in class? Or how are they choosing different books for the kids to read? Or how are they addressing diversity around this topic in their curriculum? Right? So that's now a change. That's a behavioral. A Kirkpatrick 3, a K3 is more powerful than a K2. And then sometimes you can figure out, well, what happened because of that? So because these topics were covered in a different way in class, because the teacher had more knowledge, maybe now some of the tensions went down, or some of the kids are understanding their newcomer co-students in a better way. Right? And if that's something, again, that your program does really well, you can build a strategy around that and just kind of watch things that are happening. But you always want to try and get to behavior change where you can, and that's those movement verbs. Okay, so I'm going to take you, I've got a couple more slides here about kind of techniques. Oh, I keep hitting my microphone. Techniques that I have used over the years. I actually have some kind of interesting examples I wanted to remember to tell you. So let me just pull these out. So we talked before about kind of casual conversations that sometimes can give us some really good evaluation feedback about our impact. The trick is to remember to go back to that impact mindset and to remember that when you hear an impact story, write it down. What I used to do before we had the G Drive is I had an accordion folder, and I had, old school, I had the different compartments labeled by different topics that we were watching, and anytime I heard a story about something, somebody would hand me a piece of paper with a little story on it, I would put it into that compartment in the folder, and at the end of the year when I had to do reporting, then I could kind of pull out a batch of things related to that story, right? So now we have the G Drive. So it's a little bit easier. But it's those keeping an eye on those, or an ear on those conversations, and having them not just be ad hoc, but having them be semi-structured. So if there's a theme that you're choosing, think about what are 3 questions I would want to know that I can ask consistently over the next 6 months. Nobody needs to know that I'm asking them consistently. But maybe every time a parent comes in, I might say, hey, what did you participated in that workshop XYZ? What changed for you because of that workshop? Are you doing anything different? Did anything change? Do you think you're going to change anything in the future? So I'm exploring that K3 level around behavior change, and it's just a conversation. And as soon as the conversation's over, I go in and I quick go write it down. Right? And over time, we learn a lot because we're listening. We start to see patterns, and we can adjust our programming to make sure that we're having the impact that we want to be having. And it's all by doing a semi-structured conversation over time. And this is, like, if you take a look at qualitative research, you know, the big tomes, these kinds of methods are in there. You know, we wouldn't want to prescribe medication this way, but we're trying to describe the value of the work we do and the impact and the changes that happen within the resources that we have. Another one, I'm actually going to be doing one of these with a group of teenagers in March. I'm super looking forward to it. There's a SWIS program, and there's a teen program. It used to be a summer program, and now it's just happening after school. And they want to get a sense of what the teens say has changed for them. And it's a semi-structured focus group, right? So in this case, it's teenagers, it'll probably be pizza. But if it's the parents, I've done it, just a pot of tea, right? And just sit around, and we're all, it's not me, the researcher, and you, the subject. No, you're helping me understand the impact of this program on you. And if there's more people than me, and maybe sometimes I do have a note taker, right? Then there's a lot more comfort. They start a conversation amongst each other. Oh, really? You had that issue with your teen? Yeah, oh my goodness, my teens are driving me crazy. right? So there's conversations that you can hear and you can capture your impact because you're listening for what's changing for them, why does that matter, and you can take your notes. Sometimes I record it and then create a transcript with permission, right? So then I can do the coding afterwards. So it's nothing fancy. And if you do this with, I don't know, 2 focus groups twice a year, 3 or 4 or 5 parents, right? You will start to see patterns again without it being a big evaluation strategy, right? And you can start to collect some of the evidence that you need to demonstrate that your outcomes are in fact being achieved. Focused observation is another one. This one, in effect, what you do is you create a rubric or a matrix ahead of time, and you say, I don't know, there's too many examples, right? And I keep coming back to the youth. I want to think of one with teachers. So let's say teachers the teachers have been more homogenous in the way that they've approached a particular curriculum issue. Let's say it's social studies, and they have opportunity that they could broaden it out. So there's a workshop about how teachers can kind of expand and make their curriculum a little bit more diverse. And as a SWIS worker, if you're in the school, I know it sort of always depends on the school how you interact with them, but you're noticing that teachers have different kinds of posters up around the room. That can be an observation, right? So you may put a rubric together and say, if the teacher has integrated this new knowledge, then their behavior might look like this. I'm going to keep an eye out for these 6 things that the teacher might start doing. And so you're just observing as you walk through, or parents, or really, this was one, it's teenager again, but there was a group of really shy teens, and there was a lunch program that the SWIS program was organizing. And at the beginning of the school year, I observed that there was individual little kind of clusters of the youth. They weren't all hanging out together. By the end of the year, I was back. They were hugging each other. They were physical, they were fun, they were laughing. And then there was a picnic a couple of weeks later, and one of the really shy kids had a microphone and introduced the politician that was a guest speaker. So that was an observable difference. And then I could have gone to that person and said, okay, is this because of the SWIS program, or is it because you took a Toastmaster course, right? I need to make sure that I can attribute the change to the work of the SWIS. But that's kind of another step that I can do. I can build that in. Just conscious of my time here. I'm going to have to skip a little bit ahead. There's also all sorts of alternative methods that you can use. Like even things like when I'm asking you here, raise your hands, right? It's giving me feedback. What I've also done is in a group, depending on the topic, if it's not a sensitive topic, I might say, how many of you in the class, let's say I've done a teacher training workshop, how many of you feel more confident to do blah, blah, blah? Put your hand way up if you think yes, kind of if you feel so-so, or leave it down if not. And I know how many people are in the room, then I can say, okay, 10 people out of 30 said they felt way more confident. So I'm not doing a survey. I'm getting a sense of something, right? And then it doesn't mean I won't back it up with quantitative data later, but I need to kind of explore and see if confidence being gained is even a thing that's worth measuring, right? Different exhibits like artwork. Art exhibits, when I was working at, it was Red River College, we did an art show in the EIL program, so it wasn't a SWIS, but it was remarkable what the adults put on their artwork that we could identify in terms of, it was partially how they were processing trauma. So there was powerful, powerful artwork. So again, you could create a rubric and just take a look at that by walking down the halls. In terms of that planning that I was talking about, it doesn't mean that everything gets evaluated all the time. You need to know which programs really require, or services really require a bit more intention. You know what your impact argument is that you're trying to make and where you need some of the data. So in this case, maybe you do one evaluation, it only happens in quarter 4. It doesn't happen all the time. And you'll see in this one, the baseline is the green square. There's no baseline on this one. We're not doing a pre-post evaluation. All we're doing is an evaluation in the middle, and we're asking people to think back. Do you think something has changed for you since you started? So that's an example of getting somebody to do kind of an imagined pre-post. Another one is here, maybe you only do a couple of spot checks along the way to get some feedback. Or in this case, there's a program that runs where there's no evaluation. And that may sound like an anathema, like you should never do something without evaluation. If you have a program that's running really well, do it every second time. You will still get consistent data. You will notice if something's falling off the tracks, and then you can implement it again every time. But you may not need to do everything all the time. So, I don't think we actually have time to do this. I'm presuming you want to get to lunch. What I was going to do, and maybe I'll send you off with this, is what you can do is you can think about the outcome statements that you wrote at the top of the page here. And then think about, how would I prove it? If I came up to you and said, okay, you're saying this is an outcome, prove it to me. What evidence would you bring me? Would you go talk to some people? That's maybe not a survey, right? What else could you do? Would you invite a couple of parents in for a discussion? Would you pop into the teacher staff room and say, hey, can I just ask you something? What's changed for you? Because we've been working together for 3 years. What's the 2 biggest things that have changed for you since the SWIS program started? I've also had really good luck with just a 10-minute phone call. People that don't have time for a whole interview, you can just call them and say, look, I won't take much of your time. Same thing. What changed for you? Why does that change matter? Right? You can also, I've also done it with, there was a police chief that I had to interview. I couldn't get him to interview, couldn't get him on the phone. I sent him an email and I said, the heart of what I need to know is this. Can you tell me what's changed and what would have happened if this, in that case it was a LIP, a local immigration partnership, if that didn't exist? And he sent me this beautiful paragraph because he could do it whenever he had time. And it was beautiful evidence for the report. And it completely supported all the other kinds of impact arguments that were being made. So there's sometimes simple, strong, consistent ways of gathering data about your impact. So I'm just going to summarize in my last minute. So part of it is to think about yourself in your ecosystem. You have many, many more clouds in your ecosystem than this, right? Which entities are affected most by the work that you do? Identify your main stakeholders and how do they think? What do they value? What changes for them? And of the many, many kinds of changes, which ones are most valuable for those key stakeholders, but also for you to be able to showcase what you're doing? And then make a very simple plan, and say twice a year we're going to do this, and from now on we're going to pick 1 theme or 2 themes, and for the whole year we're going to each keep an eye out for that. And at a staff meeting we'll say, hey, anybody heard another story about such and such impact? And at the end of the year, I can almost guarantee that you will have really incredible evidence of your impact that you can include in your reporting. And then you can go beyond writing just a success story of 1 person, but actually you can write a success story of a population. The parents that were in this program, or the seniors, and seniors doesn't apply to SWIS, the teenagers that we talked to, or the guidance counselors that were in that workshop. Right? So you have kind of a group that you're talking about, and you can get some other information about what changed for them because of your work. Yeah, and then keep making adjustments. I feel like I often need to do something for about 3 years. Like once I try it the first time, there's like 80% of it is working. and then I have to fix the 20%, and I get closer and closer, and then there's usually a demographic shift, so something wobbles out for a bit, but by the end of 3 years, I have a pretty good idea of which survey questions are working really well, what other techniques do I need to apply to get a little bit more of a story out, and I kind of have a plan of how much I need without doing too much. So that is it, and I want to thank the interpreters. I was going to say I can only do it in German or English. Those are my only two choices. I can't do it in French, unfortunately. So I really appreciate that the interpreters were taking care of that. Yeah. Thanks very much for listening.